country, we're seeing communities working towards opening up safely. In California, we're opening up churches, we're opening up hair salons. Even today in America, we're going to send astronauts back into space. The only place that hasn't been opening is here on the Capitol inside the House. We know that we have a responsibility that is essential that Congress does its work. Today, for more than 231 years, never have we seen a proxy vote on the floor of the House. This challenges the Constitution only to protect and empower a speaker. It violates the Constitution. It's a dereliction of duty by its members. We look at the history of America through yellow fever of 1793, the Civil War, the burning of this Capitol during the War of 1812, the Spanish flu of 1918, and even 9/11. Congress has never flinched from its constitutional duty to uphold and assemble inside this body. But today is different. As of right now, this morning, 71 Democrats have written to the House clerk to have their vote by another member. The last I checked, one member in this body on the Democratic side will vote for 5 different states, just in this proxy scheme. If I look to California Democrats, more than half of them, have last I checked, 27 Democrats, filed to vote by proxy. That means 19 million people in California will not have a voice, will be lent to somebody else. Across the country, looking at more than 71, there'll be 48 million people, constituents. These are the constituents that members of Congress believe that they would uphold their voice, have passed it to the side. When you look at the HEROES Act, I think it was only 12 Democrats who did not show, and now 71. Inside what Pelosi wanted to put forward on a proxy, she said, only if you physically cannot come to the Capitol to do your work. The Democrats continue to fail in their leadership. The Constitution is very clear about this. The founders believed we should assemble. If the Democrats are successful in allowing a proxy vote to make their own rules, what stops them from making a rule that only certain people can vote, or certain members cannot have a full vote, a half vote? Nothing. Yes, the House can make their rules, but they cannot make something different than the Constitution says. It is very clear in the Constitution, from Article 1 all through, that the House is supposed to assemble. This is unconstitutional what the Democrats are doing. It'll be quite interesting today, even if they bring up the FISA bill and try to move a rule, there'll be more Republicans on the floor voting in person than there are Democrats. Whatever the Democrats propose to bring up cannot become law because it's unconstitutional. That is why I stand with the members behind me and constituents across this country in upholding the Constitution. Exactly what we swore we would do. The founders believe we should assemble and we should work just as we've done from every challenge this country has had. While other states open up, Pelosi continues to try to shrink. It is essential that Congress continues to meet, and that's why we'll move forward with the lawsuit to uphold for the constituents across this country. Now let me turn it over to Whip Scalise.
Thank you, Kevin, and it's good to see all of you here at the Capitol. It's really important that we show up here to work at the Capitol to do our job as we're calling on Americans all across the country to safely reopen. We're helping states safely reopen. The president's been getting additional protocols issued by CDC to show how states can do this safely. You can see so many states, over 36 states have already reopened, entering into phase 1 and done it in a really smart way. We ought to be sharing the best practices, not only amongst states, but how different businesses are opening, how restaurants are doing this, how retail stores are reopening. We've seen the devastation that this has caused to our economy and the importance of getting that back up and running. We've also seen the health consequences of not having people be able to get out and go back to their doctor. Deaths that are up. In my own home parish, we've seen over a 40% increase in non-COVID related deaths from this year compared to last year, taking a 6-week period, because people aren't going out and seeing if they have chest pains. They're not going to the doctor and they're dying in their houses of heart attacks. Children aren't being immunized. And we're seeing reports now, medical studies, that show we could have a wide outbreak of things like measles that could kill a lot of children that otherwise would have been able to get those shots. So there is a cost and a consequence. It's why we need to safely reopen. It's why so many states have shown how they can do it. But Congress ought to be leading the country in showing how to safely reopen. We shouldn't be the last to reopen and show up and do our job. We should be the first. And we've been able to have votes on the House floor successfully and safely. In the last few weeks, we've had votes with over 380 members here present and voting before Speaker Pelosi put in this unconstitutional proxy voting scheme. And so when you think about this, the idea that today on the House floor, someone could be sitting in the state of California and be registered as voting present on the House floor because someone else pushed the present button for them. There was a great article written, voting present by proxy is a political oxymoron. This is not constitutional. The Constitution makes it clear that we have to have a majority of members present for a quorum to do business. And then you look at this FISA bill, and we just formally announced a whip against it because, number one, it's not going to become law. Number two, there are still so many questions that need to be answered about real abuses that happen in the FISA system. I have been a strong supporter of the FISA court and its ability to properly help maintain the national security of our country. But the FISA process was abused. And those people who abused it haven't yet been held accountable. All of the facts haven't come out on what we know happened with the FISA court. And that needs to happen to reinstitute the credibility of that important program for our national security. And so I would urge the Democrats to pull that bill, because even if it were to pass, and again, think about this proxy voting, which is constitutionally challenged. If this vote were to pass, it would only pass with proxy votes, meaning the constitutionality of this program would be questioned for a program that's already got its own taint on it. So we need to work together to help reopen the country, to show America that Congress is here working for the American people. And it's time for that to happen. Speaker Pelosi needs to start insisting that all of her members show up to work here at the Capitol, doing it safely, and working to do things like holding China accountable. Why is it that Nancy Pelosi will not spend time on the House floor holding China accountable for their role in this? That's something that they're going to have to answer for, but we're going to keep pushing for those kind of reforms. With that, I yield to our conference chair, Liz Cheney.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. You know, we're in the midst of a grave national public health and economic crisis. And as members of Congress, we have an obligation to ensure that Congress can operate. Now, there are different views and perspectives up here in terms of remote voting. We've all tried very hard to work in a bipartisan fashion. We've all tried to reach across the aisle and work with our counterparts on the Democratic side to help to come up with ways that Congress can operate, to help to come up with ways that we can fulfill the constitutional requirement that we be present. Now, in my own view, being present doesn't necessarily require physical presence. I think that remote operations are possible. But that is not the path that the Democrats have gone down. What the Democrats have done, instead of working with us, is use this crisis to try to gain partisan benefit. What the Democrats have done counter to their own report. You know, a number of us, including ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. Cole, and the leader and the whip, a number of us have worked closely with the Democrats to try to say, listen, let's come up with ways, as we did after 9/11, that we can operate in the middle of a pandemic. And let's also look for ways to protect us in the future. We know there will be future crises, and we know that we've got to come up with ways that we can operate in the future. There may be circumstances when we cannot assemble at the Capitol. And it may be that we need to look at things like voting remotely. But instead of going down that path, despite the fact that we have tried to work together, after the Speaker of the House delayed for weeks and weeks, refused to even address the issue, she then commissioned a report. The report came up with some interesting suggestions. There were some good suggestions in the report. The report also noted that proxy voting was likely unconstitutional, the Democrats' own report. So instead of going down the path of saying, how can we do this together, the Democrats have adopted a completely partisan scheme, and they have done it in a way that absolutely infringes on the rights of the minority and infringes on the Constitution. And so we today, it's a sad day that we have got to be to the position where we're bringing suit against the Speaker. We're bringing suit against the Democrats in order to prevent them from pushing this proxy vote through. And I think it's also really important to mention that one of the first items on which they are planning to use this proxy vote is an item that deals directly with the national security of this nation. Now, I'm hopeful the leader and the whip have asked that they pull that FISA vote. FISA is a crucially important set of authorities, and it's a set of authorities that was abused. We have to make sure that we deal with the abuse and that we address the abuse, but we should not push through a bill which, in my view, would fundamentally weaken our ability to keep the nation safe because of the amendments that have been added to that bill. And we shouldn't do that with proxy vote. Imagine that. You've got millions of Americans across this country who will not be represented because their members have decided to use a proxy. And we're going to pass a bill that's going to fundamentally harm the security of the nation if the Democrats continue down that path. Now, if that's not an abuse of their constitutional authority and power, I can't imagine what is. So I urge the Democrats to pull that bill, and I also urge them to rescind this rule that allows proxy voting. There are ways that we can work together. As I said, many of us have been public about wanting to do that. This is not a time for partisanship. It's not a time to try to take partisan advantage of a crisis. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Mr. Roy.
Well, thanks, Liz. I want to thank the leader and thank the whip for their efforts in bringing us together here to stand up for the Constitution. As a former federal prosecutor, a former first assistant attorney general of Texas, I've worked on a lot of these kinds of cases in my past. And it's important to me that we stand up for the Constitution, but it's also personal. My dad is a survivor of polio. He contracted the virus in 1949 and still deals with those effects today. I'm a cancer survivor. We had at least one plaintiff on our side who is battling cancer right now. And who didn't get to vote on this proxy measure, but believes that it's important for us to stand up and defend the Constitution. And I think that's what's really at stake right here. And so if you think about the founding fathers and what occurred, the leader referenced what happened with respect to Philadelphia and yellow fever. There were 5,000 deaths out of 50,000 people living in Philadelphia in 1793. 10% of the population. That would be the equivalent today of 170,000 or so people losing their lives. And that's where the Congress is supposed to meet. If you go look at a letter from October 24th of 1793 that James Madison wrote to President Washington, he outlines the concerns about how Congress should meet, where we should meet, walks through the consternation of following the Constitution to ensure that Congress does its job. And I would encourage you to look at that letter. The founders struggled with these issues. That's why it is important for us to stand up today. We cannot delegate away that which our constituents have delegated to us under the Constitution. We cannot hand that to another member, much less hand it to 10 other members. That's an extraordinary change in our constitutional system of government. And I would just point out, a year ago this last Sunday, I walked onto the floor of the House and I objected to $19.5 billion passing by unanimous consent. Why? You guys wrote stories that it was about trying to object to the funding. But the truth is, it was about process. It was about making sure our rights are protected so that we can have a vote, a roll call vote. Fast forward to March of this last year. What happened? We had a member of this body who demanded that we have a quorum and then demanded that we actually have a roll call vote. The Constitution provides that you have to have a fifth of the body agree, and the body didn't have a fifth that agreed, so we didn't have a roll call vote. That's the Constitution in action and working. That's what we're up here trying to defend and protect, to make sure that we protect our ability to represent our constituents without undermining the structure of government. I want to thank Chuck Cooper, my longtime friend, for being willing to take on this case and to do so with the excellence that he's known for. He's one of the most brilliant legal minds in the country, and I look forward to this moving forward through the system. I'll pass it off to Mr. Johnson.
Hey, thank you all for being here. Listen, for 20 years before I got to Congress, I litigated constitutional law cases in federal courts around the country. I had some difficult cases on occasion. This is a really easy one. I brought along a little visual aid here for our Democrat colleagues. I want them to take a look at the manual that each of us get each Congress. It even has our name on the front here. And it has all the rules and all the procedural goings on of the House incorporated here and published, but it is preceded by the United States Constitution. I know many of them don't carry one around in their lapel pocket like we do, but they do have a book. And I would just refer them to the actual language of the Constitution. It's been said this lawsuit and this effort is about politics. This is about the Constitution itself. Let me read you 3 excerpts. You just have to look at Article 1, the first article of the Constitution, and look at Section 4. It says, the Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December. Now we know that one, that provision was superseded by the 20th Amendment in 1933, but they echoed and adopted that same language. You flip over to Article 1, Section 5. It says, a majority of each house shall constitute a quorum to do business, and a smaller number may adjourn from day to day and may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members in such manner and under such penalties as each house may provide. Flip over to the next section, Article 1, Section 6. It says the senators and representatives of each house shall be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses. Now this is the 1780s, of course, when the Constitution was drafted and ratified. But 100 years later, the Supreme Court looked at that very specific question. We cite this in our lawsuit. It's U.S. v. Ballin, 1892. The Supreme Court said the Constitution requires, quote, the presence of a majority. And when that majority is present, the power of the House arrives. Look, this is really simple for folks back home. We have the greatest, most powerful, most free nation in the history of the world. We celebrate that on Memorial Day, as we all did this last weekend. Those who have given their lives to preserve that, to preserve this Constitution. But at only 243 years into this, we have to remember we're still a very young country. We're still a grand experiment in the ideas of liberty and self-governance. Our Constitution, that is based upon the idea that we have a government of, by, and for the people, is based on very particular foundations and presuppositions. And one of those is really important, that the members who are elected, the representatives who are elected to represent all the people throughout the country, will come together physically and arm wrestle over public policy. You'll have very different ideas, very different principles, philosophies represented. That's kind of the point. But the idea is that we would all get together and work together to find consensus, to move the ball forward for the most people. That's the premise of our Constitution. That's the premise of our republic. You can't have a republic operate any other way. We don't have a king who's a sovereign. The people are the sovereign, of, by, and for the people. And that's what meeting together and assembling and having a physical presence is all about. You can't do that by video, and you certainly can't do it by proxy. So that's what this is about. I'll tell you, I represent myself in this lawsuit. All of us are signed on as plaintiffs, and we also have constituents. And I talked to my constituent who signed on as a plaintiff last night, Lorene Spratt. She is deeply upset about this. She's a patriot. She votes in every election, and she is afraid that our votes are being watered down and that the Constitution is being violated, and she has a right to be heard. I think this goes to the Supreme Court pretty quickly, and I think the answer is pretty simple. It's right here in the book that we refer our colleagues to. I'll defer back to the majority leader. I'll say the future majority leader, Kevin McCarthy.
Well, let's open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Leader McCarthy, can we get a reaction to Leader Hoyer's remarks yesterday that the GOP Senate is already voting, basically proxy voting with unanimous consent? Get your reaction to that?
No, because anybody can object in here. What we're finding on this floor, when you have 71 Democrats put a vote to somebody else, their constituents aren't being heard. They don't know what's coming up. They're not participating in it, and it's unconstitutional. Yes, sir.
What's the practical effect of the lawsuit? I mean, you're not going to stop the proxy vote happening today, right? So what do you see is the...
I look at it like this. If I could give you an analogy, it's playing a baseball game and a protest. At the end of the game, we'll figure out who's right. What's really going to happen here, whatever the Democrats move forward, probably will never become upheld to be law. It's a question whether the Senate will take it up if you listen to Leader McConnell, because he questions even the constitutionality of what we're going forward. Let me give you one example. What if we have a bill come forward, and in the process what Speaker Pelosi puts in this proxy, is that members have to sign over, and 20 people can have all the power, because they can all hold 10 proxies. And they have to pre-tell you how they're going to vote. What if an amendment is changed? What if a motion to recommit comes up? How can that person that already gave a letter that's supposed to be across the desk able to vote for the other? In this country, we believe trees don't vote, people vote, right? So it's equal every 10 years in a census. The constituents loaned their power to that individual for 2 years to hold she or he accountable. Well, that person just lent it to somebody else. 19 million people in California believe they have a member of Congress that they're going to be able to uphold and accountable what they did. No, they gave that vote to somebody else. Somebody from another state, somebody from another district. That goes clearly against the process and the Constitution, what says we're able to do. Yes?
I'm going to follow up on that and then ask another question. So then is it your view that anything passed under proxy would be unconstitutional?
Yes.
Okay. And then as a follow-up, can you clarify, or perhaps Mr. Scalise can, something he said about FISA? Is it your view that this shouldn't pass until there's something fixed in the bill itself, or until unspecified investigations are completed, or that you're satisfied that the 2016 related investigations are done to your...
I think there's a combination of things of why FISA should take a pause. Just for instance, I'm interested in making law. I'm interested in making sure the FISA court has reform and able to sustain itself, that it's looking at foreigners, not Americans. Well, in moving forward today, it won't be signed into law. The president has questions, the attorney general has questions, but the senators themselves disagree with it. So in these moments of times, I take a deep breath, work together. When the first bill the House passed, Republicans and Democrats worked together, had a majority on both sides, be able to move it forward. We should do that same thing now. If the Democrats bring this bill up, they're just playing politics. And this is not something to play politics with, and we haven't done it all the way through. I called the leader, Steny Hoyer, last night, told him I thought, just want to tell him where Republicans are, because we had worked very closely on this bill together, and I think we should take a deep breath. Let's work forward. The difference is, let's work with the administration, let's work with other House members, let's work with the Senate, and let's make sure we make law. Since the time that we had passed the bill in the House, there has been more information coming forward, with the FISA court being used in processes that it shouldn't have been on Americans as well. And I think we should get all that information as well if we think we're going to reform this. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick change of gears for a moment. In one of your last press conferences, you touted California 25 as an indication of how Republicans are going to be doing in the upcoming House races. But still, historically speaking, the party that's in the minority, that just lost the minority, is more than likely not going to take back the House. How can you account for that?
Okay, let me account for that. If you want to take a fact that someone has lost the majority, we won it back in 4 years last time we lost the majority. I really look to what has the majority done with it. Majorities aren't given, majorities are earned. First of all, let's see what they've done. They wasted their time. They promised the American public that they would be different. They said they would act different. Well, they spent a year and a half investigating something even their own intelligent committee knew was a lie. So they spent all their time on impeachment, political. Now they changed the rules, challenged the Constitution itself just to empower a speaker, which I don't think the American public wants. They've taken the voice away from their constituents and has given it to somebody else. I think all those reasons is why they should not be given the power to govern again, because they wasted it and they lied to the American public. Now, what are the early indications? If you want to go with historical facts, I give you many historical facts. I give you historical facts about a special election each time prior was an early indication. May of 2010, a special election in Hawaii. People didn't think they had a chance to win. A Republican won. Short time later, 63 Democrats lost the majority. Same thing happened in 2018. A Republican seat in Pennsylvania went to a Democrat of Connor Lamb. Lo and behold, they won the majority. So yes, I think 25 is an indicator of the election coming forward. If you don't want to take that one, let's look at North Carolina 9. Let's look at the election was a bigger win for Republicans than it was just a few short months prior. Yes, I think that's an early indication. Also in California 25, they changed the election law. They just won that seat by 9 points less than a year and a half ago. And they changed it where it was only a mail-in ballot. But they didn't even hold there. Friday before the election, they put an in-person ballot. But where'd they put it? Throughout the district? No. They put it in the most Democratic area of the district because they were concerned. Their own candidates said they were concerned Democrats weren't turning out. So every indication you have that there are more Democrats in that district than there are Republicans. It is the only seat inside Congress that a Republican will hold that Hillary Clinton carried by a majority. So if you want to go by facts, yes, it's an early indication. But elections are in November. And I think majorities are won and are not given. And I'm not sure why the American people will give the Democrats another majority if they lied to them and didn't follow out and carry what they promised? And what did they even achieve? Name me one problem they have solved since they become a majority. And you don't have to take that from a Republican. You could take it from the most popular freshman in the Democratic Party's former chief of staff. Said the exact same thing about his own party and his own leadership. Yes, sir.
Last question.
Do you agree with the Wall Street Journal editorial board in which they basically said that the president's his comments toward this family and Joe Scarborough are sort of beneath the office, beneath the dignity?
I haven't read that editorial. I was not here with Joe Scarborough. I don't quite know about the subject itself. I don't know the subject well.
President keep tweeting, going
Yes,
after
sir.
this.
Who's ever done the phone for calling the temperatures?
I have two, if you'll allow me.
Sure.
Congresswoman Cheney, you brought up the fact that you may be open to alternatives that would still be remote voting, but wouldn't be proxy. I'm wondering if somebody can elaborate on maybe what those alternatives might be. And the second one was just more generally, some of you are very active on Twitter. The fact that Twitter decided to add that addendum to two of the president's tweets, sort of doing a fact check, just your reaction to
My
that.
first reaction with Twitter would be concerned about who they have doing the fact check. I would think it would be pretty possible to find somebody who is nonpartisan. I think if you run a company like Twitter, you'd probably first look at what that individual would put out on Twitter themselves. I do not think somebody who would think Republicans are racist, label those who are in the Republican Party equal to people who is in the Nazi Party, talk about states that are in the United States in a manner that's not appropriate simply because a Republican carried it. I'm not quite sure that's the person I would have of being the individual in charge of Twitter determining whether the facts are correct or not. Because I think he already is biased in that opinion, and I think Twitter should actually change that person. Liz, you want to address this question?
Yeah, thank you. Listen, I think that we've all, as I mentioned, we've all looked at different ways that we could operate. And in fact, there could be circumstances. You could imagine a mass casualty attack. You could imagine any sort of a national security crisis where it might not be possible for members to assemble here in the chamber. And so I think looking at what presence means is a legal question. I would note, however, that this lawsuit does not get to that issue. This lawsuit does not get to the issue of whether remote voting is constitutional. The issue in this lawsuit is proxy voting. And the point that we are making is, you know, we all have an interest in joining together in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that the people's house can operate and that the people's voice can be heard. But unfortunately, in this case, the Democrats simply rammed through a change which they themselves said in their own report was questionable constitutionally. And they rammed it through on a partisan basis in a way that absolutely takes away the voice of many of the constituents of the people who are not represented. So I think with respect to the issue of the constitutionality of proxy voting, we are absolutely unified on that. And I think all of these issues require deep research, study, attention, as you saw from Mr. Johnson, to what the Constitution says, to what the framers intended, and also a recognition of the most important thing is for this body to be able to operate. And if we create a situation where the Speaker of the House for weeks and weeks and weeks refused to deal with remote voting, refused to bring us together to operate, you create a situation where the body doesn't operate. And I cannot imagine that anybody who really has the interests of the American people at the forefront of their mind is going to think that in a national crisis, we ought to have only the President of the United States operating. The people's house have got to be here and we got to be working. So I think there's no question.
Thank you all very much.
See ya.
That was House Republicans speaking on Capitol Hill. You're watching News Now on coronavirusnow.com. We do appreciate everyone joining us always.